make films for a living or have done in the past, and I think every director of films recognizes the postpartum depression, which is probably more exaggerated for a book because it's a much bigger undertaking. It's a much more intense undertaking than a mere film. And that, you know, you're entirely focused on this thing, and then there it is, and then there's a resounding silence.
Yeah.
You talked about the psychedelics. I mean, we're jumping to the other end of history, but since you brought them up again, it's very interesting because you quote a young researcher right on late in the book, it's page 280, where he or you, I can't decide which of you it is, but it doesn't matter, describes psychedelics dissolve our opinion structure and expectation driven models of reality. They are catalysts of expectation, which is a lovely thought. In other words, that there's this unhelpful mental state you've got into, and here are drugs that aren't trying to suppress a messenger molecule in your brain, increase dopamine or decrease serotonin or whatever it is. They're acting at the level of expectations and what you think the world is going to be like before it hits you. And they're effective for some people, aren't they?
They are. And you know, that whole expectation, you know, quote, that was James Rucker, who's now at King's College London. He's doing his own trials into psilocybin, very meticulous researcher, and I really, you know, gravitated towards his work. So this idea of expectation is what we call the placebo effect. You know, do you expect to get better? And if you're given a placebo and you get better, you've almost got the expectation that you need or you want to get better. And what the psychedelics, one of the theories that kind of surrounds them is they're essentially catalysts of this placebo effect, which since you know, we had randomized controlled trials since, you know, the mid 20th century, we've always seen it as this negative thing to kind of like get rid of. And, you know, how good is this drug compared to the placebo effect? And with psychedelics, they kind of change that dynamic. They are, because they're so powerful and visual, and they change, you know, they can give you this amazing insight into either your memories or your thoughts and hopes and wishes and all of these things. It's a huge placebo. And I mean that in the most sort of positive way, that, you know, for people who come into the trials and, you know, haven't responded to many other treatments and they expect that this drug is going to help them, then they might make that into a reality. There's all of these other things that the drugs do. You know, they, you know, reduce inflammation. They can, you know, change some of the brain networks, and sort of one of the theories is they increase the chaos in the brain. And once you come out of this trip, then you can sort of almost remodel it away from a depressive circuitry. And yeah, I'd say there's an upside to that in terms of, you know, that people who want to get better can get better. And there's a downside that there's a lot of hype around these substances, especially in the US and Europe, which is part of the history I cover. And that hype feeds into these substances like no other, because, you know, if scientists are saying that this is a cure for all these types of mental illness, they're going to revolutionize psychiatry, then people take that into their trial. And a lot of these trials are actually, the patients are self-selected, which means that they're not just random people who might be inpatients in a hospital setting or people from a GP practice who haven't responded to things. They're people who've seen an ad on social media and thought, oh, that looks like something I could get involved with. So they've already got this expectation from day one that this is something that's going to help them. So it can kind of be seen as in two ways, really. I still think that they're a very effective treatment, but I think it'd be interesting to see what happens over the coming decades in terms of if that hype dies down, does the efficacy also follow suit? Because we saw that with Prozac in the 80s, 90s. People who hadn't responded to anything suddenly responded to this drug that was marketed like by people who had marketed McDonald's, and there's a lot of pharmaceutical advertising involved there, and yeah, so it's a powerful thought, I think, that we need to really change what we think of as the placebo effect, especially when it comes to psychedelics.
Yes, well, I mean, the placebo effect is, the term itself is it's rather slippery, isn't it? Because in some sense it seems like, oh, it's harnessing someone's credulity. Nothing's really happened, but they think it has.
Mm.
But I mean, another word for the placebo effect is hope.
Yeah.
In other words, would one dismiss hope because it's not real? Well, by definition, hope isn't real.
Yeah.
Things aren't better yet. You're just hoping they're going to be better.
Mm.
And yet, as you say, it's tremendously powerful. You have the lovely story of the fisherman.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Do you mind telling us that story? It's a really lovely story.
So I start with ayahuasca in South America, because I wanted to get more to the indigenous roots of these substances, because although they're sort of at the end of the book, they're actually, many people know they've been used for centuries, if not millennia. And ayahuasca was it was the first randomized controlled trial into psychedelic for depression. It was published in 2019. I tracked the work of the lead scientist, who was a neuroscientist, and was blown away by ayahuasca when he tried it in 2005, I think, on the Day of the Dead. And yeah, he told me this story of one of the people who was in this trial was a fisherman. He was in his 60s, and he was severely depressed. He hadn't responded to several antidepressants, and he had been retired for about, I think it was about 10 years at the time of writing. And so he's part of this trial. He doesn't really know what to expect from ayahuasca, except that, famously it causes gastrointestinal distress. It can make people vomit. It makes them feel, it's very uncomfortable in your stomach. And some people have diarrhea, but it's actually very rare. And so he came into this trial knowing just about that. And what Draulio, the lead researcher, had done with his colleagues was create this active placebo, which was actually, it looked like ayahuasca. It sort of had the sour, bitter taste of ayahuasca, which is a tea made from different plants from the Amazon basin. But it didn't have any of the psychoactive components. It was essentially lemon juice in there and zinc sulfate, which causes your gut to feel very uncomfortable. And so he went into this trial. They sat down in the same chair as all the other participants, and had about 8 hours in this clinical setting. And afterwards, he told Draulio he had the most amazing dream. He just realized that the reason of his depression, and this goes back to, the social causes of depression, is he'd been on the sea for so long, like all of his life, that maybe that was the only place he could be content and at peace and happy. And so straight after the trial, he went to the shore, he went to the coast, and he, realized that was part of himself. That was what made him stable. And he didn't know that he was given, lemon juice that was, had caramel food coloring in it, and he had this amazing, response to essentially, a mock tea that had no ayahuasca in it, and he was one of the successful stories from that trial. And it just shows the power of the mind of, thinking that you're going to get better, and you do, to lemon juice turned brown, I think I said in the book.
Yes. But then there's also another one of the stories which runs for quite a long time in the book, is the friendship bench. To go back to the talking cure, because it has that overtones of sort of Freud and the rest of it, but the friendship bench and tell us a little bit about what that is and how successful it's been, because it's quite remarkable in the book, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the most powerful stories that I've had the great honor of covering. I traveled to Zimbabwe as part of I wrote a feature for the Wellcome Trust's they had a magazine called Mosaic at the time, and they allowed me to, you know, put the part of the feature into the book. And it was essentially in 2006. There's in Zimbabwe there was, I think, two psychiatrists in the entire country, and both of them were in Harare, the capital city. One of them was Dixon Shamanda, the guy I spoke to and met with, and, you know, been in contact with ever since. And he, like I said at the start of our conversation, he had the problem of not only treating depression, which he knew was in the community, but actually diagnosing it, identifying it, and making people believe that this was a problem that they had. So in 2006, there was a Operation Murambatsvina. Sorry, I'm not really fluent in the language, but so it was an awful sort of tragedy that happened in the capital city, where a lot of the low-income neighborhoods were dismantled and destroyed by the military. They were seen as sort of unofficial businesses, and so they were destroyed. And what Dixon found was these sort of hints that it caused a sort of epidemic in mental health in the area, of mental illness in the area. And he worked with local people to try and identify the main sort of words that people used, and found, you know, previous work from the 1990s that found that thinking too much, so kafungisisa, was the principal sort of identifier of what people are experiencing. And it was very close to, you know, the rumination that comes with depression in any sort of like psychiatric textbook. And he identified it, and I think it's about 40% of people that he surveyed were clinically depressed by the scales that they had created. And the problem he had was, one, he was one of two psychiatrists in the whole country, and he had no money. And the clinics that he you know, worked at, they were already oversubscribed, or, you know, full of people who were suffering from HIV and malaria. And so it was a really, it's sort of, how do I kind of make good of this very bad situation? And he knew of a group of grandmothers, I think there were 14 at the start, who had been, you know, they've been used in the health sector since the 1980s, but they've mainly worked on sort of sanitation and sort of education of the local people in, you know, best practices to keep malaria and HIV at bay. And he asked them, you know, can we develop something that, you know, might be able to tackle this epidemic of mental illness? And they decided, he was sort of the expert, he had all this psychiatric knowledge, and they had all of the cultural knowledge. They decided on a wooden bench under the shade of a tree. That was, you know, the setting that they were going to use. And he originally called it the mental health bench. And I can imagine what the grandmother said to him, but he kind of gave the impression that they kind of scoffed at him and said that no one's going to sit on that bench if you call it the mental health
Not going to
bench.
get many takers, is it? Oh, I'd like to sit on the mental health bench, please.
Yeah, exactly. And so they came up with a term themselves. They said, let's call it the friendship bench. And that's when the project started in 2006. And the grandmothers have now, you know, they've been trained in problem solving therapy, which is kind of like a descendant of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's sort of like a subgrouping of that sort of psychotherapy. And yeah, essentially they've just, it's kind of just been a huge success story.
To be clear, in other words, someone comes and sits on this bench, and that very act in itself is without lots of, you know, forms being filled out in duplicate in doctors' offices and making appointments, and it's a signal saying, could someone please talk to me? I just feel like I need some help. And then one of the grandmothers presumably goes and sits next to them.
Yeah, I mean, the grandmother will.
Then
the grandmother largely will be there for a morning, and anyone can go and talk to her. They advertised it through local churches, and they had a drama school sort of like adopt and try and destigmatize the whole story of depression, saying it wasn't from curses and things that were quite popular kind of descriptions of mental illness at that time. And so then they sit down next to each other, and in the early years they had a sort of the grandmothers would hold a almost like a tutorial of problem-solving therapy and go through what problems the people have in their life, which could be, poverty or malnutrition or any of the diseases that might be kind of leading to their depression. And now it's been through several clinical trials. There've been, randomized controlled trials with these grandmothers who've grown in sort of number around not just Harare, but I follow their work to New York, and now it's kind of being developed in the UK as well. So these benches that are popping up with, people who are, they're not psychiatrists, they're not therapists, they're not PhDs or MDs or anything like that. They're just trusted people from the community who often have experienced the things that they're trying to help treat. So in the US, went to New York, and one of the biggest problems there is the opioid crisis.
Yeah.
So a lot of the they're called peers because they're not grandmothers in like they're in Zimbabwe. They're called peers in New York, and a lot of those people have been through either rehab or suffered from homelessness and mental health conditions, and so they're really sort of embodiments of success. They kind of have been through that storm. Someone described it to me, and can then guide other people through it as well.
So if I came and sat on one of these benches, and you could be that peer, as you say, you've been there. How would it start? I mean, there I am. I've come to sit on this friendship bench, and I feel slightly embarrassed, and I don't know what else to do. I've got that far.
I think it would be just a discussion. It would be, you don't have to say your name. You don't have to describe anything you don't want to. It's just.
So what would you say to me?
I would just say, how are you? And just start it as a conversation.
Just try and draw out, encourage me to say whatever I brought with me that morning.
Yeah, and then you would have to go through. I think you'd have to, in terms of the clinical trials, you'd have to go through this actual methodology of problem-solving therapy, which is trying to identify the things that are problematic in that person's life and trying to find solutions that they might not have really thought about. So these can be, if it's financial, it can be, have you ever thought about, is there someone in your circle who might be able to sort of give you a loan that you can then start your own business venture, or have you thought about this particular sort of NGO that we know about? And in the US, it's mostly, don't go to that rehab center. This one is probably best suited to what you're dealing with, and trying to really sort of guide people through the best approach towards hopefully remission.